Two companies compete for the same market with completely different resources. One has unlimited budgets, massive teams, and established infrastructure everywhere. The other has 5 employees working from a shared garage space. Guess which one wins the market every single time? Most people believe larger companies with more resources always dominate markets. Why do billion-dollar corporations consistently lose to tiny startups? Size appears advantageous because resources enable extensive research and development capabilities. But what if corporate advantages actually become systematic competitive disadvantages? Think about the last major innovation that disrupted an entire industry. Did it come from the biggest player or smallest challenger? The corporate trap operates by convincing large companies that resources equal victory. If you want to understand why small companies consistently outmaneuver giants, subscribe to Prof. Jiang Explain and share this with someone working corporate. They need to see why size becomes weakness in competitive environments. The system creates different relationships with competition depending on your organizational approach. When we say competitive advantage, we mean different strategies based on scale. For large corporations, success means leveraging existing resources and following established procedures. They trust that superior budgets and extensive teams will eventually dominate. They believe systems reward resource deployment and that patience creates sustainable dominance. For small companies, success means understanding which battles matter and which don't. They focus on speed rather than processes and bend conventional approaches strategically. They recognize that markets reward agility rather than resources consistently over time. Think about whether you rely on resources or optimize for speed. Consider the difference between following procedures versus creating innovative solutions effectively. This explains how different approaches to competition affect market outcomes and success. The difference isn't about capability versus inability, but strategy versus bureaucracy completely. But here's where it gets interesting about corporate systems and competitive disadvantage mechanisms. The trap doesn't just encourage resource-based thinking instead of strategic agility. It actually prevents corporations from recognizing that size creates systematic vulnerabilities. When companies grow large, they accept bureaucratic processes that competitors exploit intentionally. This creates what economists call institutional drag, where established players move slowly. Meanwhile, agile companies understand that speed enables market capture rather than resources. Consider how often large companies launch successful innovations versus small companies. Does having more resources actually lead to better market outcomes? The corporate trap becomes sophisticated when examining how it handles decision-making processes. Large organizations typically require extensive approvals and committee consensus for changes. This requirement prevents rapid response to market shifts and competitive threats. The bureaucracy creates what organizational theorists call decision paralysis, where action requires consensus. Large companies analyze extensively, while competitors capture market share through execution. Meanwhile, small companies can pivot immediately based on market feedback and opportunities. Do you spend time analyzing decisions or making them quickly? What happens when you need approval versus having autonomous decision-making power? The corporate trap exploits what behavioral economists call resource dependency in competitive psychology. Companies develop emotional attachment to existing investments rather than market responsiveness. More resource commitment creates less flexibility and fewer adaptation opportunities consistently. This dependency prevents companies from recognizing that market success requires constant evolution. Choosing resource optimization over market agility often produces companies that lose relevance. Meanwhile, adaptive companies understand that winning requires changing methods based on circumstances. The corporate trap creates what sociologists call institutional superiority complex, where size feels powerful. Companies derive satisfaction from impressive resources, even when resources prevent achievement. This satisfaction prevents recognition. That capability doesn't guarantee victory in dynamic markets. Resource pride also prevents companies from learning from successful competitors who operate. Meanwhile, agile companies focus on effectiveness rather than approval from stakeholders. They can adopt winning methods rather than maintaining losing institutional positions. The corporate trap creates learned helplessness, where companies accept market disruption rather than large companies often rationalize losses by blaming unfair competition rather than strategic. This rationalization prevents learning how successful companies actually operate in dynamic environments. Helplessness becomes problematic when companies cannot adapt strategies to overcome market disadvantages. They continue using methods that fail rather than adopting approaches that work. Meanwhile, adaptive companies change tactics based on results rather than maintaining consistency. But something more sophisticated happens with corporate culture and innovation prevention mechanisms. The trap doesn't just encourage resource-based thinking instead of strategic innovation about markets. It creates institutional pressure where innovative behavior feels risky, even when effective. Organizations develop beliefs that established processes represent safety, while experimental approaches represent this institutional framework prevents companies from using effective methods, because methods unproven. The pressure also creates resistance to changing through innovation rather than procedures. Meanwhile, successful companies understand that competition requires experimentation rather than just resources. They can use effective methods while others limit themselves through institutional constraints. The corporate trap handles what economists call information bottlenecks, where knowledge advantages determine outcomes. Large companies filter information through hierarchies, while small companies access markets directly. This filtering creates disadvantages because information processing delays responses more than competitors. Information bureaucracy also ensures that market signals reach decision makers slowly while operate. Meanwhile, direct companies receive immediate market feedback when it actually benefits. They can lose competitive timing rather than building advantages through information speed. The corporate trap also exploits what psychologists call consensus bias in competitive decision-making. Companies expect internal agreement before external action and become paralyzed when disagreement. This expectation prevents recognition that competition involves rapid responses, including uncertain ones. Consensus illusion also prevents companies from protecting market position against disruption by competitors. Meanwhile, decisive companies understand that competition involves speed rather than agreement. They can capture advantages rather than debating them through extended internal processes. But there's something even more sophisticated happening with corporate structure and market responsiveness. The trap doesn't just prevent innovative thinking through institutional constraints about methods. It creates systematic disadvantage where large companies serve small companies' interests unknowingly. Large companies often validate market opportunities through extensive research that competitors exploit. This validation creates what economists call market intelligence transfer, where established companies small. The transfer also prevents large companies from capturing opportunities they identify. Meanwhile, agile companies monitor large companies' research while protecting their strategies. They can capitalize on insights rather than sharing them through institutional announcements. The corporate trap addresses what behavior scientists call market illusion, where companies misunderstand competition. Large companies believe they're playing resource games, while small companies understand speed. This misunderstanding creates systematic disadvantage because resource strategies lose in dynamic environments. Game confusion also prevents companies from adopting appropriate strategies for actual rather than. Meanwhile, realistic companies recognize market types and adjust strategies accordingly rather than they can compete effectively, rather than optimizing resources in competitive situations. The corporate trap also exploits what economists call institutional hazard in competitive behavior. Companies take excessive risk with established methods because they believe resource. This protection illusion prevents recognition that established behavior often creates vulnerability environments. Institutional confidence also prevents companies from developing protective strategies necessary for competitive success. Meanwhile, cautious companies understand that competition requires adaptation rather than just resources. They can defend market position rather than exposing themselves through institutional rigidity. But perhaps most devastating involves how corporate beliefs affect market learning. Companies that follow established procedures never learn how successful companies actually. This ignorance prevents understanding of methods that create competitive advantages in environments. Bureaucracy also creates what learning experts call strategy blindness, where companies companies focus on processes rather than outcomes, and miss tactics that determine. Meanwhile, observing companies study successful strategies, regardless of institutional evaluation, consistently. The corporate trap creates competitive fragility where established companies cannot handle agile opponents. This fragility prevents effective response to competitive pressure when others use advantages. Limited competitive skills also prevent success in environments that reward agility resources. Fragility becomes problematic when companies cannot adapt to competitive realities that require they maintain losing strategies rather than developing winning approaches through learning. Meanwhile, resilient companies can adjust methods based on competitive requirements rather than preferences. The corporate trap works by providing institutional satisfaction while preventing competitive effectiveness. It allows companies to feel established while remaining unsuccessful in dynamic situations. The system provides procedural comfort while preventing strategic development that creates achievement. Companies experience resource satisfaction while losing competitive advantages necessary for market success. Meanwhile, actual success requires strategic thinking rather than just resource deployment consistently. Understanding this trap doesn't mean avoiding growth, but recognizing agility priorities effectively. It means maintaining strategic flexibility while scaling operations where possible in markets. If you want analysis of how competitive systems favor agile players, subscribe to Prof. Zhang Explained. Share this with someone working at large corporations. They need understanding why institutional size becomes competitive disadvantage in dynamic market environments. The corporate trap also creates what economists call innovation resistance, where established companies cannot embrace disruptive technologies because existing investments prevent strategic pivots effectively. This resistance creates systematic disadvantage because innovation adoption requires abandoning established approaches. Innovation blindness also prevents companies from recognizing when market fundamentals change permanently. Meanwhile, adaptive companies can embrace new technologies without institutional constraints, preventing adoption. They can transform business models rather than protecting obsolete ones consistently. Consider how your company responds to new technologies versus protecting existing investments. Does institutional commitment prevent innovation adoption or enable competitive advantage development? The corporate trap exploits what psychologists call committee dependency in decision-making processes. Companies require group consensus rather than individual accountability for strategic choices. This dependency prevents rapid response necessary for competitive environments that reward speed. Committee paralysis also creates what decision theorists call analysis addiction, where companies over-research opportunities while competitors capture market share through action rather than execution. Meanwhile, decisive companies understand that imperfect action beats perfect planning consistently. The corporate trap creates what sociologists call hierarchy worship, where authority levels feel companies derive satisfaction from organizational structure, even when structure prevents effective decision-making. This worship prevents recognition that flat organizations often outperform hierarchical ones consistently. Status pride also prevents companies from adopting efficient organizational structures that successful competitors. Meanwhile, flexible companies focus on results rather than maintaining hierarchical positions. They can optimize structure rather than preserving institutional hierarchy unnecessarily. But there's something even more sophisticated happening with corporate structure and competitive. The corporate trap doesn't just prevent agile thinking through institutional constraints. It creates systematic vulnerability, where large companies broadcast strategic intentions while large companies often announce strategic initiatives through press releases that competitors immediately. This announcement creates what competitive intelligence experts call strategic telegraphing, where the broadcasting also prevents large companies from maintaining competitive advantages. Through research. Meanwhile, stealth companies operate without announcements while monitoring competitors' public communications consistently. They can exploit disclosed strategies rather than revealing their approaches through communications. The corporate trap handles what game theorists call competitive signaling, where transparency gets punished. The corporate trap also exploits what economists call scale disadvantage, where size creates problems. But perhaps most insidious involves how corporate beliefs affect innovation development. The corporate trap creates innovation fragility, where established companies cannot handle technology disruption. The corporate trap also creates what behavioral economists call resource allocation problems, where budgets matter. But there's something more sophisticated about how corporate culture affects competitive positioning. The corporate trap addresses what organizational theorists call metric gaming, where performance improvements matter. The corporate trap also exploits what psychologists call comfort zone expansion, where companies maintain familiar approaches. But perhaps the most devastating aspect involves how corporate culture affects competitive positioning. Understanding this trap doesn't mean avoiding institutional development, but recognizing competitive priorities effectively. It means developing strategic agility while maintaining core capabilities where possible in markets. If you want analysis of how competitive systems favor agile players, subscribe to Prof. Jiang Explained. Share this with someone working at large corporations.